In the dust-choked fields of 1890s Oklahoma Territory, a pregnant woman pushes a rusted plow behind a weary mule, her swollen belly straining against worn calico. Etta Morales has buried her father, lost her husband to fever, and watched neighbors whisper behind gloved hands about the mixed-blood woman who dares farm alone. The red earth cracks beneath an unforgiving sun, and each furrow she carves feels like defiance against a world determined to break her spirit. From the ridge above, Weston Cain watches through narrowed eyes. The wealthiest cattleman in 3 counties, he's known for his silver spurs and solitary ways. Town folks call him everything from war hero to heartbroken widower, but none dare ask which story rings true. When he rides down to offer help, she refuses with fire in her dark eyes. But what happens when a woman who's lost everything meets a man desperate to find redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Morales homestead, illuminating the weathered frame house that had stood against Oklahoma's harsh winds for nearly 2 decades. Etta paused at the kitchen window, her calloused hands cradling a cup of chicory coffee that had grown cold while she watched the horizon. The land stretched endlessly before her, a patchwork of red earth and struggling grass that her father had claimed with nothing but determination and a government deed that proclaimed him worthy of the American dream. That deed now rested in a tin box beneath her bed, the edges worn soft from handling. It bore her father's name, Diego Morales, written in careful script beside the official seal that had granted him 160 acres of raw territory. The paper represented more than land ownership. It was proof that a man with Spanish blood and calloused hands could build something lasting in a place that didn't always welcome his kind. Etta's reflection in the window glass showed a woman who carried both her father's stubborn chin and her mother's gentle eyes. At 24, she had already buried both parents and the man she'd called husband, though no preacher had ever spoken words over them. The baby growing within her was all that remained of Thomas Whitfield, a drifter who'd stayed long enough to plant more than just his spring wheat before the fever took him. The town of Cedar Falls lay 3 miles south, close enough to reach for supplies, but far enough to avoid the daily whispers that followed her like dust clouds. She'd learned to read the faces of shopkeepers and church ladies, their expressions shifting from polite acknowledgement to something harder when they thought she wasn't looking. The mixed-blood woman who farmed alone, the unwed mother who refused to apologize for her circumstances, the stubborn girl who wouldn't sell her father's land and move somewhere more suitable for a woman in her condition. Mrs. Patterson at the general store had made her feelings clear just last week, sliding Etta's purchases across the counter with a barely concealed disdain. "Shame about your situation," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "A woman in your condition ought to have family to turn to. Perhaps it's time to consider more practical arrangements." Practical arrangements. Etta knew what that meant. Sell the land, take whatever pittance the bank offered, and disappear into the anonymity of a larger town where no one would ask questions about a woman with a baby and no husband. The thought made her stomach clench, though whether from revulsion or the baby's restless movements, she couldn't say. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention back to the present. A lone rider approached from the north, his silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. Weston Cain sat his black stallion with the easy confidence of a man who'd never known want, his broad shoulders squared against the morning sky. Even from a window, Etta could see the silver gleam of his spurs and the fine cut of his coat, marks of wealth that set him apart from every other man in the territory. She'd first noticed him 3 weeks ago, a distant figure on the ridge that overlooked her fields. He'd taken to appearing there most mornings, never approaching, never speaking, just watching her work with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. The other women in town spoke of him in hushed tones that mixed fear with fascination. Rich as Croesus, they said, owned more land than any man had a right to. Some claimed he'd made his fortune in the war, others whispered about cattle rustling and worse. All agreed he was a man to be feared and respected in equal measure. Now, he was riding directly toward her house, and Etta felt her hackles rise. She set down her coffee and stepped onto the porch, her worn boots echoing against the weathered planks. The baby shifted restlessly as she straightened her spine, preparing for whatever conversation was about to unfold. Weston reined in his horse. At the edge of her yard, his pale eyes taking in the details of her homestead with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to assessing value. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair that showed no grey and a face that might have been handsome if not for the hard lines around his mouth and eyes. Everything about him spoke of money and power, from his hen-tooled saddle to the gold watch chain visible beneath his vest. "Miss Morales," he said, touching the brim of his hat with a gesture that was polite but not deferential. His voice carried the slight drawl of a man who'd spent time in the South, though his accent was refined, educated. "Mr. Cain." She kept her tone neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. "You're a long way from your own land." A ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Not so far. My property runs right up to your eastern boundary." He gestured toward the ridge where she'd so often seen him watching. "I own everything from here to the Canadian River." The casual way he stated his vast holdings made Etta's jaw tighten. She'd known he was wealthy, but the scope of his land ownership dwarfed her small homestead. "Then you'll understand why I need to get back to my work. The fields won't plow themselves." That's what I wanted to discuss. He swung down from his horse with fluid grace, ground-tying the reins with the confidence of a man whose mount was trained to perfection. "I've been watching you work that field with your mule and that old plow. Must be hard labor for a woman in your condition." Heat flooded Etta's cheeks. "My condition is none of your concern." "Maybe not, but common decency is." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of leather and something else. Bay rum, perhaps, or cologne, that cost more than she spent on supplies in a month. "I've got men who could have your fields ready for planting in half the time. Good workers, fair wages. You wouldn't have to lift a finger." The offer hung in the air between them like a challenge. Etta felt the familiar surge of pride that had sustained her through every hardship, every whispered slight, every moment when giving up seemed like the easier path. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Cain. It's not charity, it's business." His eyes held hers, steady and unblinking. "You need your fields plowed. I need—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I need to know that good land isn't going to waste." "My land isn't going to waste." "No, but it's not reaching its potential either." He gestured toward her half-plowed field where the old mule stood with its head hanging low. "That animal's got maybe one more season in him, and that plow's older than both of us. You're fighting a losing battle with inferior equipment." The truth of his words stung, but Etta refused to let her face show it. "I'll manage. Will you?" He stepped closer, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "What happens when the baby comes? You planning to plow with an infant strapped to your back?" The question hit too close to home, voicing the fears that kept her awake at night. "That's my concern. It doesn't have to be." His voice gentled, taking on a quality she hadn't expected. "Let me help, Miss Morales. No strings attached, no expectations. Just neighbors looking out for each other. Neighbors." The word sounded strange, coming from a man who owned half the territory. Etta studied his face, searching for signs of pity or condescension, but found only a kind of weary sincerity that surprised her. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why do you care what happens to me or my land?" For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "Maybe because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. Maybe because I've got more than I need, and you've got less than you deserve." He stepped back, giving her space to breathe. "Or maybe because I think your father would have wanted someone to look after his daughter." The mention of her father caught her off guard. You knew him? I knew of him. Man who could make this ground productive when everyone said it was worthless. That takes character. He looked around the homestead with something approaching respect. Diego Morales was a good man. His daughter shouldn't have to struggle alone. The unexpected praise for her father's memory nearly undid her careful composure. She wrapped her arms around her middle, feeling the baby's restless movements beneath. Her palms. I can't pay you. I'm not asking you to. Then what do you want? The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Weston studied her face for a long moment, and Etta felt exposed under his penetrating gaze, as if he could see straight through to her fears and hopes and desperate determination. I want to see this land flourish, he said finally. I want to see you succeed. Call it an investment in the future of the territory. It was a pretty speech, but Etta sensed there was more he wasn't saying. Men like Weston Cain didn't make gestures of pure altruism, especially not toward women like her, but the offer was tempting, and her practical side warred with her pride. I'll think about it, she said at last. He nodded, seeming to understand that it was as much of a concession as she was prepared to make. That's all I ask. He moved back toward his horse, swinging into the saddle with the same easy grace. You know where to find me if you change your mind. Etta watched him ride away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She remained on the porch. Long after he'd disappeared over the ridge, one hand pressed to her belly and her mind churning with questions she couldn't answer. What did Weston Cain really want? And why did the thought of seeing him again make her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear? 3 days had passed since Weston Cain's visit, and Etta had spent every waking hour wrestling with his offer. Each morning she rose before dawn to work the fields, pushing herself harder than she should have, as if physical exertion could silence the voice in her head that whispered he might be right. The old mule, Segundo, wheezed with each step, and the rusted plow blade caught on every root and stone, making progress painfully slow. The baby had grown more restless too, pressing against her ribs with increasing frequency. Doc Henley had warned her to take things easier, but what choice did she have? The spring planting season wouldn't wait for her convenience, and every day of delay meant a smaller harvest come fall. On the 4th morning, the heat rose early from the red earth, shimmering in waves that made the horizon dance. Etta had barely made it halfway across the field when a sharp pain shot through her back, stealing her breath. She gripped the plow handles, waiting for it to pass, but instead of fading, the pain intensified, radiating around her sides like a band of fire. Easy, Segundo, she gasped, though the mule had already stopped, sensing something amiss. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the early hour, and her vision blurred at the edges. The baby rolled violently within her, as if protesting the strain she'd been placing on both their bodies. She tried to take a step forward, but her legs buckled. The world tilted sideways, and she found herself on her knees in the turned earth, the plow handles slipping from her grasp. Panic rose in her throat as she realized how isolated she was. No neighbors close enough to hear if she called for help. No one expected to check on her for days. The sound of hoofbeats penetrated her haze of pain and fear. Through the shimmer of heat waves, she saw a familiar silhouette approaching at a gallop. Weston Cain rode like a man possessed, his horse's hooves throwing up clouds of dust as he raced across the field toward her. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, dropping to his knees beside her with an urgency that belied his usual controlled demeanor. What happened? Are you hurt? Etta tried to speak, but another wave of pain stole her words. She doubled over, one hand pressed to her back, the other cradling her belly. The baby had gone still, too still, and that frightened her more than the pain. The baby, she managed to whisper. Weston's face went pale beneath his tan. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms, lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing. We're getting you to Doc Henley. Now. Segundo, she protested weakly, though even speaking required tremendous effort. I'll send someone back for the mule. He settled her carefully across his saddle, one arm supporting her back while he guided his horse with the other. "Hold on to me." The ride to town passed in a blur of jolting pain and mounting fear. Etta clung to Weston's vest, her face pressed against his chest, breathing in the scent of leather and bay rum that had become strangely comforting. She could hear his heart beating rapidly beneath her ear and feel the tension in his muscles as he urged his horse faster. Doc Henley's office occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on Cedar Falls Main Street. Weston carried Etta up the steps without pausing, shouldering through the door with a force that rattled the windows. "Doc!" he bellowed. "Doc Henley! I need you!" The elderly physician emerged from his back room, wiping his hands on a stained apron. Samuel Henley had been doctoring in the territory for over 20 years, and his weathered face had seen every kind of suffering the frontier could devise. He took one look at Etta and gestured toward his examination room. "Put her on the table. What happened?" "She was plowing," Weston said, settling Etta gently on the padded table. "Collapsed in the field." Doc Henley's bushy eyebrows drew together in a disapproving frown. "Plowing? In her condition?" He moved to Etta's side, his practiced hands checking her pulse and examining her pallor. "Miss Morales, how far along are you?" "7 months, Etta whispered. "Maybe 8. The doctor's frown deepened. "And you've been doing heavy farm work this entire time?" "I have to. There's no one else." "There's plenty of someone's else," Weston interjected, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Starting with the men I offered to send 3 days ago." "Doc." Henley glanced between them, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I see. Well, Miss Morales, your pride may have just cost you and your baby dearly." He pressed his stethoscope to her belly, listening intently. After what felt like an eternity, he straightened. "The baby's heartbeat is strong, but you've put yourself into early labor. The contractions have stopped for now, but if you keep pushing yourself like this, you'll deliver that child months too soon." The words hit Etta like a physical blow. "What do I need to do?" "Complete bed rest. No work, no lifting, no stress. You need to stay off your feet for the next month at minimum, longer if possible." "That's impossible." The fields can wait," Weston said firmly. "Your baby can't." Doc Henley nodded in agreement. "Mr. Cain is right. You have a choice to make, Miss Morales. You can risk your child's life for the sake of some plowed ground, or you can accept help when it's offered." Etta closed her eyes, feeling tears of frustration and fear leak from beneath her lashes. Everything she'd worked for, everything her father had built, would be lost if she couldn't plant this season's crop. But the alternative, losing the baby, was unthinkable. "How much will this cost?" she asked quietly, opening her eyes to meet Doc Henley's sympathetic gaze. "Don't worry about that now," the doctor replied. "I'll handle it," Weston said before Etta could protest. "Whatever she needs." The casual way he dismissed what was probably a month's income for her only emphasized the vast gulf between their circumstances. Etta felt a flush of shame and anger burn through her cheeks. "I don't want your charity." "It's not charity," he said, echoing his words from 3 days before. "It's an investment in the future." "Whose future?" she demanded. Something flickered in his eyes, pain perhaps, or longing. "The territories, the lands, your child's." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Maybe mine." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Doc Henley cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the personal turn the conversation had taken. "Whatever arrangements you two work out can wait," he said briskly. "Right now, Miss Morales needs rest and quiet. Mr. Cain, you can take her home, but I want someone checking on her every few hours, and I mean it about the bed rest. No getting up except for necessities." "I'll make sure she follows orders," Weston promised. "I don't need a nursemaid," Etta protested weakly. "No, but you need someone who cares whether you live or die," Doc Henley said bluntly. "And right now, Mr. Cain seems to be the only one volunteering for the job." The truth of those words stung worse than any physical pain. Etta had spent so long being strong, being independent, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone worry about her welfare. The realization that Weston, essentially a stranger, was showing more concern for her well-being than anyone else in the territory was both humbling and terrifying. As Weston helped her down from the examination table, Etta caught sight of something glinting against his vest, a thin gold chain that disappeared beneath his shirt. For just a moment, she wondered what he wore close to his heart, what secrets lay hidden beneath his composed exterior. "Thank you," she said quietly, as they prepared to leave Doc Henley's office. "For what? For finding me. For bringing me here. For—" She gestured helplessly, unable to find words for the complex mix of gratitude and bewilderment she felt. "For being a decent human being." He opened the door for her, his expression softening. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Morales. We've got a lot of arguing ahead of us before this is over." Despite everything, Etta found herself almost smiling. "Is that a promise or a threat, Mr. Cain?" "Both," he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his smile reached his eyes. As they walked toward his horse, Etta felt something shift between them. A recognition, perhaps, that their lives had become entangled in ways neither of them had anticipated. The baby stirred restlessly within her, as if sensing the change, and she pressed her hand to her belly, wondering what kind of future she was carrying into the world. Whatever happened next, she was no longer facing it alone. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it filled her with a new kind of fear, the terror of depending on someone who might disappear as suddenly as he'd appeared in her life. But as Weston's strong hands helped her into his saddle, she realized that fear would have to wait. Right now, survival, hers and her baby's, was all that mattered. And if that meant accepting help from a mysterious cattleman with secrets in his eyes, then so be it. The war between her pride and her practicality was over. Practicality had won, but the victory felt suspiciously like surrender. Etta woke to the sound of unfamiliar voices in her yard. Through the thin curtains of her bedroom window, she could see 3 men she didn't recognize working near her porch, their movements purposeful and efficient. One was examining the sagging steps with the practiced eye of a carpenter, while another measured the distance between the house and the well. The third man stood with his back to the window, but his confident posture reminded her of Weston. She struggled to sit up, her body protesting after 2 days of enforced bed rest. Doc Henley had been adamant about her staying horizontal, and Weston had taken it upon himself to ensure she followed orders. He'd arrived each morning and evening since her collapse, bringing supplies and checking on her condition with a thoroughness that was both comforting and mildly irritating. The bedroom door opened quietly, and Weston's head appeared around the frame. "You're awake. Good. How are you feeling?" "Like a prisoner in my own home," Etta replied, though her tone lacked real heat. The rest had done her good. The constant ache in her back had eased, and the baby seemed calmer, no longer pressing urgently against her ribs. Better a healthy prisoner than a dead martyr. He entered the room, carrying a tray with what looked like actual food, rather than the hardtack and beans she'd been living on. "Mrs. Chen from the laundry sent soup. Said you need to eat for 2. The Chinese woman who ran the laundry with her husband was one of the few people in town who'd always treated Etta with simple kindness. That was thoughtful of her. "There are more thoughtful people in this world than you give credit for," Weston said, setting the tray on the small table beside her bed. "You just have to let them help." Etta watched him arrange the soup bowl and spoon with careful precision. "Who are those men in my yard?" "Workers. They're making some improvements to your property." "What kind of improvements?" "The kind that will make it easier for you to manage on your own when the baby comes." He avoided her eyes, suddenly very interested in adjusting the napkin beside her bowl. "Weston." She used his first name deliberately and saw his shoulders tense at the sound. "What did you do?" "I had some materials lying around. Seemed wasteful to let them go unused." "What materials?" He sighed, recognizing that she wouldn't let the matter drop. Lumber, hardware, a few tools, nothing elaborate. Through the window, Etta could see one of the men carrying what looked like a brand new board toward her chicken coop. Those don't look like scraps. Maybe I'm a generous man with high-quality scraps. Despite her frustration, Etta found herself fighting back a smile. You're impossible. I've been called worse. He settled into the chair beside her bed, a position he'd taken to occupying during his visits. The work needs doing anyway. Your front steps are a death trap, and that chicken coop won't survive the next strong wind. I could have fixed them. Myself. When, between the plowing and the planting and the harvesting and the baby raising, he leaned forward, his expression growing serious. Etta, you can't do everything alone. No one can. The use of her first name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. They'd been dancing around a growing familiarity for days, but this felt like acknowledgement of something deeper. I've been alone for a long time, she said quietly. I know. So have I. Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. For just a moment, his carefully maintained composure slipped, revealing a glimpse of the loneliness he carried beneath his confident exterior. Before she could respond, a knock at the front door interrupted them. Weston rose smoothly. That'll be Miguel with your supplies. Supplies? Food, mostly. A few other necessities. He was already moving toward the bedroom door. I'll be right back. Etta listened to the murmur of voices from the front of the house, catching fragments of conversation in both English and Spanish. She heard her name mentioned several times, always with a respectful tone that surprised her. When Weston returned, he carried several wrapped packages and a knowing look. Miguel says to tell you the senora at the ranch has been asking about you. Apparently she wants to send over some baby clothes. What, senora? Etta asked, confused. Miguel's. Wife Rosa. She helps manage my household. Weston set the packages on her dresser with careful precision. She's raised 6 children of her own and has strong opinions about what expectant mothers need. The thought of someone she'd never met taking an interest in her welfare was both touching and overwhelming. She doesn't even know me. She knows. You're carrying a child and struggling alone. That's enough for Rosa. He turned back to face her, and Etta caught something almost wistful in his expression. She says every baby deserves to be welcomed into the world with love and preparation. And you told her about me? I told Miguel you were a neighbor who needed assistance. Rosa drew her own conclusions. Weston's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. She's very good at drawing conclusions. Etta felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from gratitude or hormones or simple exhaustion, she couldn't say. Why are you doing this? Really? Weston was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear him. My wife lost a baby once, early in the pregnancy but late enough that we'd started making plans. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, touching something beneath his shirt. The doctor said if she'd had better care, more rest, it might have turned out differently. The admission hung between them like a bridge across dangerous water. Etta felt her breath catch, understanding flooding through her. I'm sorry, it was a long time ago, but the pain in his voice suggested otherwise. Margaret died 2 years later from a fever. Never had another chance. Is that why you wear her ring? His hand stilled against his chest, and Etta realized she'd voiced a thought that should have remained private. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Yes, he said simply. I wear her ring. He met her eyes, and she saw no shame there, only a kind of weary honesty. Some habits are harder to break than others. The silence stretched between them, comfortable and uncomfortable at the same time. Etta found herself studying his face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of grief carried for too long. The careful way he held himself that suggested a man who'd learned to keep his emotions locked away. You don't have to save me to save her, she said gently. I know that. He stood, suddenly restless. But maybe I can keep you from making the same mistakes she did, the same mistakes I let her make. There was self-recrimination in his voice. That made Etta's heart ache. What happened to your wife wasn't your fault, wasn't it? He moved to the window, looking out at his workers with unseeing eyes. I had the money for the best doctors, the finest care, but I was too proud to admit she needed help, too stubborn to see that my way of doing things wasn't working. And, now you think you can fix that by helping me? Maybe, or maybe I just can't stand by and watch another woman struggle when I have the means to help. He turned back to her, his expression vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. Does it matter why, as long as the help is genuine? Etta considered the question, weighing her pride against her needs, her independence against the growing connection she felt with this complicated man. No, she said finally, I suppose it doesn't. Relief flickered across his features. Good, because Miguel left some things for you to look at. He gestured toward the packages on her dresser. Seeds, mostly. Rosa included some herbs she swears by for expectant mothers. Seeds for your kitchen garden. Rosa noticed you don't have one, and she was horrified. Apparently no proper household should be without fresh vegetables and herbs. Despite everything, Etta laughed. She sounds formidable. She is. You'll like her. Weston moved toward the door, then paused. The seeds are good quality. Heirloom varieties that will produce plants you can save seed from for next year. After he left, Etta carefully unwrapped the packages, finding not just seeds, but detailed notes written in careful Spanish about planting times and care instructions. Someone had taken considerable time and thought to provide exactly what she needed, when she needed it. As she held the small packets of seeds, feeling their weight and promise, Etta realized that accepting help didn't have to mean surrendering. Her independence. Maybe it could mean something else entirely. Partnership, community, the beginning of something she'd never dared to hope for. Outside, the sound of hammering resumed as Weston's workers continued their improvements to her property. But for the first time since her father's death, the sound felt like progress rather than charity. The seeds in her hands seemed to pulse with potential, and Etta found herself imagining the garden they might become. Rows of vegetables and herbs, growing strong in the Oklahoma soil, providing sustenance for her and her child. Perhaps hope, like seeds, simply needed the right conditions to flourish. The cradle sat in the corner of Etta's bedroom, like a promise half-kept. Her father had started it the week before he died, his gnarled hands shaping each piece of wood with the patient care of a man who understood that some things were worth taking time to get right. The headboard bore his initials carved in flowing script, and the rockers had been sanded smooth as silk, but the sides remained unfinished, rough boards waiting for someone to complete what he'd begun. Etta ran her fingers along the carved initials, feeling the familiar ache of loss that accompanied thoughts of her father. Diego Morales had been a man of few words, but deep feeling, and she could imagine his joy at the prospect of a grandchild to rock in the cradle he was crafting. Now it fell to her to finish what he'd started, though her carpentry skills were rudimentary at best. "That's beautiful work," Weston said from the doorway, making her jump. She'd been so lost in memory that she hadn't heard him arrive for his evening visit. "My father made it," she said, settling back against her pillows. 2 weeks of bed rest had improved her color considerably, and the baby's movements had settled into a more comfortable rhythm. "I can see his craftsmanship in the details." Weston entered the room and knelt beside the cradle, examining the joinery. With an expert eye, "These dovetails are perfect." He must have been a skilled woodworker. He learned from his father in Mexico before they came north. Said it was important to know how to make things with your hands, things that would last. Etta's voice caught slightly. "I don't know how to finish it." "What needs doing?" "The sides need to be attached and sanded. There's supposed to be a design carved along the rails. Roses, I think." He sketched it out, but never got to start the carving. Weston studied the unfinished pieces scattered around the cradle's base. "I could help with that if you'd like." The offer surprised her. "You know woodworking?" "Enough to be useful. My grandfather was a cabinet maker back in Virginia. Taught me the basics when I was young." He picked up one of the side panels, testing its weight and examining the grain. "This is good wood, oak, well seasoned. Your father chose quality materials. Everything he did right," Etta said softly. "Even when we didn't have much money, he'd find a way to get the best materials he could afford. Said it was better to wait and do something properly than to rush and do it poorly. Smart man." Weston set the panel down carefully. "Would you like me to bring some tools tomorrow? I could work on it here while you rest." The idea of sharing this intimate project with him felt both natural and terrifying. The cradle was more than furniture. It was her father's last gift to his future grandchild, a tangible connection between past and future. Allowing Weston to help complete it would be letting him into the most private chambers of her heart. "I'd like that," she said quietly. He nodded, understanding the significance of her acceptance. "I'll bring my grandfather's tools. They're better suited to detailed work than most." 3 days later, Weston arrived with a leather tool roll that looked old and well cared for. He spread it open on her bedroom floor, revealing an array of chisels, gauges, and carving knives that gleamed with the patina of constant use. "These belong to your grandfather?" Etta asked, fascinated by the craftsmanship of the tools themselves, and his father before him. The family trade, passed down through generations. He selected a chisel and tested its edge against his thumb. "I was supposed to inherit the business, but the war changed those plans. What happened? I went off to fight, came back different. Couldn't settle into the quiet life of a craftsman after what I'd seen." His hand stilled on the tools, and Etta saw shadows cross his face. "Took my inheritance and headed west instead. Figured I could make a fresh start where nobody knew what I'd been." "And did you make a fresh start?" "For a while." He picked up her father's sketch of the rose design, studying the delicate lines. "Until I met Margaret and tried to build something permanent again." There was pain in his voice when he mentioned his wife, but also a kind of acceptance that hadn't been there before. Etta sensed that talking about his past was becoming easier for him, as if sharing the memories helped lighten their weight. "Tell me about her," she said impulsively. Weston looked up from the sketch, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Margaret? If you want to. Sometimes it helps to remember the good things." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the carved initials on the cradle's headboard. "She was light. That's the word I always come back to. She could walk into a room and make everything brighter just by being there." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She had this laugh that could make you forget whatever was troubling you. Used to say I was too serious, that I carried the world's weight on my shoulders. Was she right?" "Usually." He selected another tool and began measuring the side panel against the cradle frame. "She tried to teach me to see joy in small things. Morning coffee shared in comfortable silence. The way sunlight looked streaming through lace curtains, the sound of rain on the roof." Etta found herself leaning forward, drawn by the tenderness in his voice. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Too good for a man like me, but somehow she saw something worth loving. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he began the delicate work of fitting the panels. "I keep thinking if I'd been better at seeing what she saw, maybe things would have turned out differently, or maybe they turned out exactly as they were meant to," Etta said gently. "Maybe her gift to you was teaching you how to see those things, even if it took time for the lesson to take hold." Weston paused in his work, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Is that what you think? That everything happens for a reason?" "I think we make our own reasons out of what happens to us. The question is whether we choose reasons that make us bitter or ones that help us grow. And which have you chosen?" Etta considered the question, her hand moving instinctively to her belly where the baby stirred restlessly. "I'm still deciding. But watching you work on my father's cradle, listening to you talk about your wife, I think maybe some of the best things come from the hardest places." They worked in comfortable silence after that, Weston's skilled hands bringing her father's vision to life while Etta watched and offered suggestions. The rose design began to emerge from the oak, delicate petals and thorny stems that seemed to dance along the rail. Each cut was deliberate, purposeful, transforming rough wood into something beautiful. "You're very good at this," Etta observed, as he added the final details to a particularly intricate bloom. "It's peaceful work. Makes me remember why my grandfather loved it so much." He paused to examine his progress, then looked up at her. "He used to say that working with wood taught you patience, that you couldn't rush good craftsmanship any more than you could rush a tree to grow." "Sounds like he and my father would have gotten along well." "I think so too." Weston returned to his carving, adding tiny leaves to complement the roses. They both understood that some things are worth taking time to do right. As the afternoon wore on, Etta found herself studying Weston's face as he worked. The harsh lines around his eyes seemed softer when he was concentrating on the detailed carving, and she caught glimpses of the man he might have been if life hadn't marked him so deeply. His hands moved with a grace that spoke of muscle memory and inherited skill, and she realized that in sharing this task, he was giving her something precious, not just his labor, but a piece of his family's legacy. "The baby's moving," she said suddenly, pressing her hand to her side, where a particularly vigorous kick had surprised her. Weston looked up immediately, concern flickering across his features. "Are you all right?" "More than all right, I think." "He likes the sound of the carving." She laughed as another strong movement rippled across her belly. "Or she. Either way, this little one seems to approve of your work." "May I?" Weston asked hesitantly, his eyes fixed on her hand pressed against her side. For a moment, Etta wasn't sure what he was asking. Then, understanding dawned, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. The request was intimate, more personal than anything that had passed between them. But something in his expression, wonder mixed with old grief, made her nod. He set down his tools and moved to sit beside her on the bed, his large hand hovering uncertainly over her belly. That is, Margaret never got far enough for me to feel here," Etta said softly, guiding his hand to where the baby was most active. "Just wait." They sat in silence, his palm warm against her side through the thin fabric of her dress. For a moment, nothing happened, and Etta worried the baby had gone still. Then a strong kick pressed against Weston's hand, and his face transformed with amazement. "That's incredible," he breathed. "So strong." "Strong and stubborn, just like his mother," Etta said, though her voice came out more husky than she'd intended. "His?" Weston asked, his hand still resting gently on her belly. "Or her? I just have a feeling it's a boy. Something about the way he moves, like he's already impatient to get out and explore the world." Another kick, stronger than before, made them both laugh. "Definitely impatient," Weston agreed. "Good thing we're almost finished with his cradle." The word "we" hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. But as Weston returned to his carving and Etta settled back to watch him work, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death. The comfort of shared purpose, of not having to face the future entirely alone. The cradle was nearly complete now, transformed from her father's unfinished dream into something beautiful and functional. But more than that, it had become a bridge between past and future, between loss and hope, between two people learning that healing sometimes came through helping others heal. As the sun began to set outside her window, painting the room in shades of gold and amber, Etta closed her eyes and listened to the rhythmic sound of Weston's carving. The baby moved restlessly within her, and she imagined it responding to the love being carved into every detail of its future resting place. Perhaps this was what family really meant, not just blood ties, but the choice to care for one another, to share in both the work and the wonder of building something lasting together. The drought began subtly, as such things often do. First, the morning dew disappeared, leaving the grass brittle beneath the rising sun. Then the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of Etta's property slowed to a trickle, and finally stopped altogether. By the third week of May, the sky had taken on the hard, metallic quality that spoke of rain withheld, and the newly planted seeds that had sprouted so promisingly began to wither in the relentless heat. Etta stood at her bedroom window, watching Weston examine her struggling garden with the grim expression of a man who'd seen droughts before. Doc Henley had finally allowed her short periods out of bed, and the freedom to move around her house had revealed the full extent of the crisis developing outside her walls. The tiny green shoots that had filled her with such hope were now brown and brittle, curling in on themselves like disappointed prayers. "How bad is it?" she asked when Weston entered the house, his boots leaving traces of dust on her freshly swept floor. "Bad enough." He removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, leaving it disheveled in a way that made him look younger and more vulnerable. "The well's holding for now, but it's dropping fast. At this rate, you'll be dry within the month." The words hit her like physical blows. Without water, there could be no garden, no crops, no way to sustain herself and the baby through the coming winter. What about the other farms? Same story everywhere. Johnson's well went dry yesterday, and the Peterson place isn't far behind. Weston moved to stand beside her at the window, his shoulder brushing hers in a contact that was becoming familiar. "The cattle are starting to cluster around any water source they can find." "Including yours?" "So far, yes. The springs on my land are deeper, older. They'll hold longer than most." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Long enough to get through this dry spell, if it doesn't last too long." Etta understood what he wasn't saying, that his water could save her, crops, her livelihood, her future. But asking for such help would make her dependent on him in ways that went far beyond accepting a few carpentry repairs or bags of seed. "You're going to offer to share your water," she said quietly. "I'm going to insist on it." His voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. "Your garden dies. You have no food for winter. Your well goes dry. You have no water for yourself or the baby. This isn't about pride anymore, Etta. It's about survival. And what do you want in return?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, but weeks of accepting his help had made her wary of the debt she was accumulating. Every kindness, every gesture of support added weight to the invisible scales between them. Weston turned to face her fully, his pale eyes serious. "I want you to come stay at the ranch." "What?" "Just until the drought breaks. You'd have your own room, complete privacy. Rosa's been asking about you constantly, and there are medical supplies there if—" He gestured toward her belly. "If anything happens with the baby." The proposal was so unexpected that Etta found herself speechless. Stay at his ranch, in his house, dependent on his hospitality and charity. The idea should have appalled her, but instead she felt a treacherous flutter of something that might have been relief. "I can't do that." "Why not?" "Because people will talk, because it's not proper, because I barely know you." The reasons tumbled out, each one true but somehow insufficient. "People are already talking," Weston said pragmatically. "And as for propriety, there are a dozen people living at the ranch who can serve as chaperones. Rosa alone would defend your reputation more fiercely than your own mother." "I don't have a mother." "Then let Rosa be one to you, temporarily." His voice gentled. "She's already prepared a room just in case. South-facing windows, a view of the garden she's planning to show you." "She's planning to show me her garden. She's planning to put you to work in it, actually." Rosa believes that expectant mothers should keep busy with gentle, productive tasks. Apparently, helping with the garden would be good for both you and the baby. Despite her reservations, Etta found herself curious about this woman, who seemed to have such strong opinions about her welfare. What kind of garden? Vegetables, herbs, flowers, things that need patient tending rather than heavy labor. Weston moved closer, and she caught the familiar scent of leather and bay rum that had become strangely comforting. "She's particularly proud of her roses. Says they're the finest in the territory." Roses, like the ones Weston had carved so carefully into her father's cradle. You told her about the cradle design? I mentioned it. She was delighted that you appreciated good rose cultivation. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Rosa has strong opinions about people who understand the value of beauty alongside practicality. And if I refuse your offer, then I'll have water hauled to your place twice a day until the drought breaks. His expression grew serious again, but it would be easier on everyone if you'd just accept the invitation. Etta moved away from the window, needing space to think. The rational part of her mind recognized the wisdom of his offer. At the ranch, she'd have access to medical care, proper food, and the company of other women. Rosa's presence would ensure propriety, and the change of scenery might do her good after weeks of confinement. But accepting would mean stepping fully into Weston's world, seeing how he lived, meeting the people who served him. It would mean acknowledging that the careful distance she'd maintained between them was no longer sustainable. What about my house, my animals? Miguel can look after the place, feed the chickens, milk the cow, keep everything secure. Weston had clearly thought through the practical details. Your animals would actually do better with access to the ranch's water supply. You've planned this all out. I've considered the possibilities, yes. He didn't look apologetic. I prefer to be prepared. Etta sank into her father's old chair, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on her. Everything logical pointed toward accepting his offer, but something deeper, fear perhaps, or the instinct for self-preservation, made her hesitate. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked suddenly. "What do you mean? About the ranch? About why you really want me there?" She studied his face, looking for tells. "You're not a man who acts purely from altruism, Weston. There's something else driving this offer." For a moment, he was silent, and she thought he might deny her suspicions. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, and she saw a flash of the vulnerability he worked so hard to keep hidden. "The house is too quiet," he said finally. "Has been for 2 years. Rosa worries about me, thinks I'm turning into a hermit. She's probably right. So I'd be doing you a favor by accepting. Maybe, or maybe I'd be doing myself one." He looked at her directly, his expression stripped of pretense. "I've gotten used to having someone to worry about, someone to check on. When this is over and you go back to your own place, I'll miss it." The honesty in his admission took her breath away. "Weston, I know it's selfish. I know you don't owe me anything, and that my loneliness isn't your responsibility." He moved toward the door, then paused. "But I'm asking anyway. Come stay at the ranch, Etta. Let Rosa fuss over you and the baby. Let me know you're safe while this drought runs its course. And after, when the rains come and I want to go home, then you go home. No questions asked, no obligations incurred." He met her eyes steadily. "You have my word." After he left, Etta remained in her father's chair, staring out at her dying garden. The smart choice was obvious. Accept his offer. Ensure her safety and the baby's welfare. Wait out the drought in comfort and security. But smart choices had a way of leading to complications, and she sensed that spending time in Weston's world would change things between them in ways she wasn't prepared for. The baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing her agitation. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the strong movements that spoke of life, determined to flourish despite difficult circumstances. Perhaps that was the answer. Sometimes survival required taking risks, accepting help, trusting in the kindness of others even when the cost wasn't entirely clear. That evening, as she watched the sun set over her parched fields, Etta made her decision. Tomorrow, she would ask Weston to take her to see his ranch, to meet the formidable Rosa, who had taken such interest in her welfare. If the place felt right, if the people seemed genuine, she would accept his offer. The drought would end eventually. Such things always did. But she was beginning to suspect that whatever grew between her and Weston during their forced proximity might prove more permanent than any weather pattern. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as she felt the baby's movements slow into the gentle rhythm of sleep, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow with something dangerously close to anticipation. The Cain ranch spread across the horizon like a vision from another world. As Weston's buggy crested the final hill, Etta caught her breath at the sight below. A sprawling adobe house with red tile roofs, surrounded by carefully tended gardens that seemed to defy the drought's grip. Cottonwood trees provided shade. Over outbuildings that looked more like small villages than simple ranch structures. And everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of prosperity and careful planning. "It's beautiful," she breathed, unconsciously leaning forward in her seat. "Margaret designed most of it," Weston said quietly, his hand steady on the reins despite the emotion in his voice. "She had ideas about creating something that would last, something that honored both the land and the people who worked it." As they drew closer, Etta could see the details that spoke of a woman's touch: flower boxes beneath windows, herb gardens laid out in careful geometric patterns, and shade structures positioned to catch every beneficial breeze. It was clear that considerable thought and money had been invested in creating not just a functional ranch, but a beautiful home. A woman emerged from the main house as they approached, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and her dark eyes bright with curiosity. She was small and compact, with the kind of serene confidence that came from managing large households and strong-willed men. This, Etta realized, must be the formidable Rosa. "Senora Morales," Rosa said warmly, as Weston helped Etta down from the buggy. "Welcome to our home. We are so pleased to finally meet you. Please call me Etta." She accepted Rosa's offered hand, surprised by the gentle strength in the older woman's grip. "Thank you for having me." "Nonsense. This is what neighbors do." Rosa's gaze traveled quickly over Etta's form, taking in her condition with the practiced eye of someone who'd attended many births. "Miguel told me you've been on bed rest. How are you feeling now?" "Much better. Doc Henley says I can move around more, as long as I'm careful." "Good, good. Fresh air and gentle activity are better than lying in bed all day." Rosa shot a meaningful look at Weston. "Men always think rest means doing nothing, but women know better." Weston raised his hands in mock surrender. "I defer to your expertise in all matters relating to expectant mothers." "As you should." Rosa turned back to Etta with a conspiratorial smile. "Come, let me show you the room we've prepared. Then you must see the garden. I have so many questions about the roses Weston carved for your baby's cradle." As they walked toward the house, Etta marveled at the details she could see up close. The adobe walls were thick and cool, painted in warm earth tones that complemented the natural landscape. Windows were positioned to capture light while minimizing heat, and the courtyards between buildings created natural cooling areas where people could gather in comfort. "This must have taken years to build," she observed. "5 years of active construction," Rosa replied. "But Senora Margaret spent months planning every detail before they broke ground. She wanted to create something that would work with the climate rather than fighting against it." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. Very intelligent, very determined. Rosa's voice held genuine affection. "She would have liked you, I think. You have the same spirit, the same refusal to give up when things become difficult." The room Rosa showed her was on the ground floor, with French doors that opened onto a private courtyard filled with blooming flowers. The bed was covered with a quilt that looked handmade, and a comfortable chair sat positioned to catch the morning light. Fresh flowers in a simple ceramic vase graced the bedside table, and Etta could see that considerable care had been taken to make the space welcoming. "The bathroom is just down the hall," Rosa explained, "and this door leads directly to the garden, so you can come and go as you please without feeling like you're disturbing the household." "It's perfect," Etta said, meaning it. The room felt private yet connected, comfortable without being ostentatious. "Thank you for going to such trouble." "No trouble at all. I've been looking forward to having another woman in the house." Rosa's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Senor Weston is good company, but he's not much help when I want to discuss the finer points of rose cultivation or baby preparations." They spent the next hour touring the gardens, and Etta found herself genuinely impressed by Rosa's knowledge and skill. The vegetable plots were laid out with mathematical precision, each plant positioned to take advantage of available water and shade. The herb garden contained varieties Etta had never seen, carefully labeled with both common and scientific names. But it was the rose garden that truly took her breath away. Dozens of bushes created a living tapestry of color and fragrance, each variety chosen for its hardiness in the harsh Oklahoma climate. Climbing roses covered arbors that provided welcome shade, while compact bush varieties created borders and focal points throughout the space. Despite the drought, the roses bloomed abundantly, their roots clearly reaching deep water sources. "How do you keep them so healthy?" Etta asked, kneeling carefully beside a particularly spectacular bush covered in deep red blooms. "The secret is in the soil preparation and the watering system," Rosa explained, her pride evident. "Senora Margaret and I spent months researching the best varieties for this climate. These roses are survivors. They can handle heat and wind and drought, but they reward careful tending with abundant flowers. Weston said you wanted to put me to work in the garden, only if you'd enjoy it. I thought perhaps you might like to help me with the seed saving and some of the lighter maintenance tasks." Rosa's expression grew serious. "But mostly I hoped you might enjoy having something beautiful to tend while you wait for your baby to arrive." As they walked among the roses, Rosa sharing stories about each variety and its particular needs, Etta felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. The garden was a world unto itself, a place where time moved differently and worries seemed less pressing. She could understand why Margaret had loved creating this sanctuary and why Rosa had dedicated herself to maintaining it. "There's something I need to tell you," Rosa said as they settled on a bench beneath a climbing rose covered in white blooms. "About the town and what some people are saying." Etta's peaceful mood evaporated. "What kind of things?" "The usual. Gossip that small-minded people spread when they don't understand a situation." Rosa's voice held quiet anger. "Mrs. Patterson has been particularly vocal about your arrangement with Senor Weston." "What has she been saying?" "Nothing worth repeating in detail. But you should know that yesterday she refused to serve Maria Gonzalez because Maria defended you." Rosa's hands clenched in her lap, said she wouldn't do business with anyone who supported immoral behavior. The words hit Etta like a physical blow. She'd known that staying at the ranch would fuel gossip, but she hadn't considered how it might affect others who showed her kindness. "Maybe I should go home," she said quietly. "Absolutely not." Rosa's voice was firm. "You let small people drive you away and they win. You stay here, hold your head high, and show them that their opinions don't matter. But if it's affecting other people, then they'll learn who their real friends are." Rosa reached over and patted Etta's hand. "I've lived in this territory for 20 years, and I've seen how these things work. People like Mrs. Patterson thrive on drama and judgment. Give them something else to talk about, and they'll forget all about you. And if they don't, then they'll learn what it means to cross the Cain family." There was steel beneath Rosa's gentle exterior. "Senor Weston may be quiet about his influence, but he has it. Mrs. Patterson's store depends on the business from this ranch and the men who work here. She'd be wise to remember that." That evening, as Etta settled into her new room, she reflected on the complexities of her situation. The physical comfort and safety of the ranch were undeniable, but the social cost was proving higher than she'd anticipated. Through her open windows, she could hear the gentle sounds of the household settling for the night. Horses being tended in the stable, quiet conversations in Spanish drifting from the workers' quarters, the distant sound of Rosa humming as she finished her evening tasks. For the first time since her father's death, she wasn't alone. But the price of that comfort was becoming clear. By accepting Weston's protection, she'd stepped into his world in ways that would be difficult to step back out of. The town's judgment might be unfair, but it was real. and it would follow her, long after the drought ended and she returned to her own land. As she prepared for bed, Etta caught sight of something on her bedside table that hadn't been there earlier, a small leather box that looked old and well cared for. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a pair of gardening gloves that had clearly belonged to a woman. They were beautiful things, made of fine leather and embroidered with tiny roses along the cuffs. A note in Rosa's careful handwriting lay beneath the gloves. "Senora Margaret would want these to be used again. The roses are waiting for your touch." Etta held the gloves carefully, imagining the hands that had worn them before her. Margaret Cain had built something beautiful here, something that honored both the harsh realities of frontier life and the human need for beauty and grace. Now Etta was being invited to continue that work, to tend what Margaret had planted, to add her own care to the legacy of roses that bloomed despite drought and hardship. Tomorrow she would put on Margaret's gloves and work in Margaret's garden, accepting the gift of beauty and purpose that the dead woman had left behind. Tonight she would sleep in safety and comfort, letting the sound of Weston's household lull her into peaceful rest. But she would not forget that gifts often came with prices, and that the deeper she allowed herself to be drawn into this world, the harder it would be to remember where she ended and it began. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday morning when the heat hung over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Etta was working in the rose garden, deadheading spent blooms with Margaret's gloves protecting her hands, when she noticed Rosa emerge from the main house with the expression of barely concealed alarm. Behind her walked a thin man in a dusty suit, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the kind of self-important expression that Etta had learned to distrust. "Etta," Rosa called, her voice carefully controlled. "Could you come inside, please? There's someone here who wants to speak with you." The man's pale eyes swept over Etta as she approached, taking in her condition and her dusty work dress with obvious disapproval. "Miss Morales, I presume? I'm Jeremiah Blackwood, representing the Territorial Land Office. I understand you're claiming ownership of the Morales homestead?" "I'm not claiming anything," Etta replied carefully, removing Margaret's gloves. "I own the land. My father filed the proper papers when he claimed it 18 years ago." "Yes, well, that's what I'm here to discuss." Blackwood opened his satchel and withdrew a folder thick with official-looking documents. There seemed to be some irregularities in the ownership records. Weston appeared at that moment, having heard voices from his office. His expression darkened when he saw Blackwood, and Etta noticed a muscle tick in his jaw. "Blackwood, what brings you out this way?" "Official business, Cain. Nothing that concerns you." Blackwood's tone held a dismissiveness that made Etta's hackles rise. "Anything involving Miss Morales concerns me," Weston said evenly. "She's a guest in my home. How convenient." Blackwood's smile was cold. "Perhaps you'd both better sit down. This may take some time." They gathered in Weston's study, Rosa hovering protectively near Etta's chair, while Blackwood spread his papers across the massive oak desk. The room was lined with law books and agricultural texts, and Etta noticed that the walls held maps of the territory marked with colored pins, undoubtedly tracking Weston's various land holdings. "Now then," Blackwood began, adjusting his spectacles. "The Morales homestead was originally filed under the Homestead Act of 1862, claiming 160 acres in Section 12 of Township 4. The original claimant was one Diego Morales, a Mexican national who claimed citizenship through marriage to an American woman. "That would be my mother," Etta said quietly. "Elena Morales, née Patterson." "Ah, yes, Elena Patterson." Blackwood shuffled through his papers. "Interesting family history there, but that's not the issue at hand." He pulled out a document that looked newer than the others. "The problem is, with this marriage certificate." He placed a folded paper on the desk. Between them, Etta leaned forward to examine it, her heart beginning to pound as she recognized the names written in faded ink. Thomas Whitfield and Etta Morales, dated 8 months ago. "Where did you get this?" she demanded. "From the county records office in Guthrie, filed 3 weeks ago by a concerned citizen who felt the territorial authorities should be aware of certain irregularities in land ownership claims." Weston picked up the document, his expression growing thunderous as he examined it. "This is a forgery." "Is it?" Blackwood's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "The signatures look authentic to me, and the witness signatures—" He paused dramatically. "Well, one of them is particularly interesting." He pointed to a name at the bottom of the certificate. "Janet Patterson." Etta felt the blood drain from her face. "Mrs. Patterson witnessed this?" "According to the document, yes. She's prepared to testify that she witnessed the marriage ceremony between you and Thomas Whitfield last September." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the effect of his revelation. "Of course, that raises some interesting questions. About your current living arrangements." "This is ridiculous," Weston said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Thomas Whitfield died of fever 6 months ago. I attended his burial myself." "Indeed he did, which makes this marriage certificate problematic." Blackwood gathered the papers with practiced efficiency. "You see, if this marriage took place, as documented, then Miss Morales was legally married at the time of Whitfield's death. But if it didn't take place," he shrugged eloquently, "well, that makes her child illegitimate, which under territorial law affects her inheritance rights to the homestead." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Etta felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. She understood now why Blackwood had come, why Mrs. Patterson had suddenly become so helpful with witness signatures. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Weston asked, his tone deadly calm. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply pointing out that there are questions about Miss Morales's legal status that need to be resolved." Blackwood returned the documents to his satchel. "The bank has expressed concerns about the mortgage payments on the homestead, and given these questions about inheritance rights—" "The mortgage is current," Etta said, finding her voice at last. "For now. But banks don't like uncertainty, Miss Morales. They prefer clear titles and legitimate heirs." Blackwood stood, clearly preparing to leave. "I'm sure you understand their position." After he left, the study remained silent for a long moment. Rosa busied herself gathering the scattered papers Blackwood had left behind, while Weston stood at the window with his back to the room. Etta remained in her chair, trying to process the full implications of what had just occurred. "It's a trap," she said finally, obviously. Weston turned from the window, his expression grim. "The question is whether they can make it stick." "Mrs. Patterson will testify that she witnessed a marriage that never happened. Who's going to contradict her?" "I will, for starters, and Doc Henley, and Miguel." Weston's voice grew more determined with each name. "Half the territory knows Thomas. Whitfield never married you, but the other half doesn't know us that well. And if the bank decides my claim to the land is questionable—" Etta pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby stir restlessly. "They can foreclose regardless of whether the mortgage is current." Rosa looked up from her paper gathering. "There has to be something we can do, some way to fight this." "There is," Weston said quietly. "But Etta's not going to like it." Both women looked at him expectantly. "Marriage," he said simply. "A real one, properly witnessed and documented. It would establish Etta's legal status beyond question and give her the protection of my name and resources." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Etta stared at him, trying to read the expression on his carefully controlled face. "A marriage of convenience," she said slowly, "if that's what you want to call it." Something flickered. In his eyes, hurt perhaps, or disappointment, though I'd prefer to think of it as a partnership between two people who care about each other's welfare. "Weston," Etta began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions his proposal stirred up. Gratitude, fear, a treacherous flutter of something that might have been hope. "Think about it," he said gently. "You don't have to decide right now, But understand that this won't go away on its own. Mrs. Patterson and whoever's behind this scheme won't stop until they get what they want. What do they want? Your land, most likely. Prime homestead acreage this close to town is valuable, especially with the railroad coming through. His expression darkened. Someone's been buying up properties around here, using various legal maneuvers to force owners to sell cheap. And you think they're targeting me specifically? I think you're vulnerable, and they know it. A pregnant woman with questionable legal status struggling to work the land alone. He shook his head. You're an easy target for people with enough money and influence to manipulate the system. Rosa stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger. This is what Mrs. Patterson meant when she refused to serve Maria. She wasn't just gossiping, she was preparing the ground for this attack. Almost certainly, Weston moved to stand behind Etta's chair, his presence solid and reassuring. The question now is what we do about it. Etta closed her eyes, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on her like stones. Accept Weston's proposal and secure her future at the cost of her independence. Refuse and fight a legal battle she couldn't afford against people with resources she couldn't match. Either choice would change her life irrevocably. How long do I have to decide? She asked. Blackwood will file his official report within the week. After that, the bank will have legal grounds to begin foreclosure proceedings. Weston's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. So, not long? And if I say yes, what would you expect from such a marriage? Companionship? Partnership? A chance to build something lasting together? His voice was quiet, but steady. I won't lie and say it would be purely business, Etta. I've grown fond of you, and I think you know that. But I'd never force more than you were willing to give. The honesty in his admission made her chest tight with emotion. She looked up at Rosa, who was watching the exchange with knowing eyes. What do you think? Etta asked her. I think some opportunities come disguised as problems, Rosa said carefully. And I think you could do worse than marrying a man who's already proven he'll protect what he values. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The first hint of rain in weeks. Etta took it as a sign that change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. The question was whether she would face that change alone or accept the partnership Weston was offering. As she sat in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his success and security, Etta realized that her choice had been made the moment she'd put on Margaret's gloves and begun tending Margaret's roses. She'd already begun building a life here, already begun depending on Weston's protection and care. Now all that remained was making it official. The first drops of rain began falling. That evening, fat droplets that struck the dusty earth with audible thuds and released the sweet scent of approaching relief. Etta stood on the covered porch outside her room, watching the sky darken with clouds that had been absent for too many weeks. The drought was finally breaking, but the timing felt bitterly ironic. Just as nature offered renewal, her own world was collapsing around her. She'd spent the afternoon in her room, ostensibly resting, but actually wrestling with the impossible choice Weston had laid before her. Marriage to a man she barely knew, no matter how kind he'd been, felt like surrendering everything she'd fought to preserve of her independence. But losing her father's land, letting schemers and bullies drive her from the only home she'd ever known, felt like betraying his memory and her child's future. The rain smells good, Rosa said, joining her on the porch with 2 cups of chamomile tea. The gardens have been waiting for this. Everything's been waiting, Etta replied, accepting the warm cup gratefully. I just wish it had come sooner. Rain comes when it comes. We can't hurry it and we can't stop it. Rosa settled into the chair beside her. People are like that too sometimes. Change happens on its own schedule, not ours. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the rain intensify from scattered drops to a steady patter that promised real relief for the parched earth. In the distance, Etta could see lights beginning to appear in the windows of the workers' quarters, and she caught the sound of laughter and conversation in Spanish drifting across the courtyard. "Tell me about Weston's war service," she said suddenly. Rosa's cup paused halfway to her lips. "What do you want to know?" "The truth. I've heard rumors, but I'd rather know what really happened." "Why does it matter?" "Because if I'm going to marry him, I need to understand who he really is, beneath all that careful control." Etta set down her tea and turned to face Rosa directly. "He wears his past like armor, and I need to know what he's protecting himself from." Rosa was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands wrapped around her cup as if drawing warmth from it. "It's not my story to tell, but you know it. I know some of it. Miguel knows more. They served together." Rosa's voice grew sad. "What I can tell you is that the man who went to war was different from the one who came back. Younger, more trusting. The war took something from him that he's never gotten back." "And Margaret, did she help him heal?" "She tried. For a while I think she succeeded, but some wounds go too deep for even love to reach completely." Rosa looked at Etta with searching eyes. "Is that what you're afraid of? That you'll try to love him and find there's nothing there to love back?" The question cut closer to the truth than Etta was comfortable admitting. "I'm afraid of a lot of things right now. Love is always frightening. It asks us to trust in things we can't control." Rosa's voice gentled. "But I've watched Senor Weston with you these past weeks. I've seen him come alive in ways I haven't witnessed since Senora Margaret died. That has to count for something." Before Etta could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the rain. A rider was coming fast, his horse's hooves throwing up splashes of muddy water as he raced toward the main house. Rosa stood immediately, her expression alert. "That's Miguel," she said, recognizing the silhouette even in the dim light. "Something's wrong." They watched as Miguel dismounted near the front entrance, not bothering to properly secure his horse. Before hurrying inside, within moments, lights appeared in Weston's study windows, and Etta could see the shadows of men moving urgently back and forth. "I should go see what's happening," Rosa said. But before she could move, Weston himself appeared on the porch, his hair damp from the rain and his expression grim. "What is it?" Etta asked, rising from her chair despite the baby's weight-making. "The movement awkward. News from town. Doc Henley sent Miguel to warn us." Weston's jaw was tight with controlled anger. "Blackwood filed his report this afternoon. The bank is moving faster than we expected." "How much faster?" "They're calling your mortgage due in full by the end of the week. If you can't pay, they'll begin foreclosure proceedings immediately." The words hit Etta like physical blows. "That's impossible. The mortgage isn't even close to being due. They're claiming the questionable ownership status constitutes a breach of the loan terms. It's legal manipulation, but it's effective." Weston moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring, despite the devastating news. "They're not giving you time to fight the marriage certificate claim through proper channels." "How much time do we have?" Miguel also brought word from the preacher. "He's willing to perform a ceremony tomorrow morning if we need him to." Weston's eyes searched her face. "It would give us legal standing to challenge their claim, but I'd have to decide tonight." "Yes." Rosa excused herself quietly, sensing the private nature of the conversation that was about to unfold. Etta barely noticed her leaving, too focused on the impossible pressure building in her chest. Everything was happening too fast, leaving her no time to think or plan or find a third option. "There's something else," Weston said quietly. "Something. I should have told you sooner." A chill ran down Etta's spine that had nothing to do with the rain. "What?" "The reason I have so much influence in the territory, why people defer to my opinion, why the bank would hesitate to cross me." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "I didn't make my fortune in cattle or land speculation." "Then how?" "The war. Specifically, what I did during the war." His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, touching something beneath his shirt. "I was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for actions at Gettysburg. The government granted me substantial land holdings as recognition for my service." Etta stared at him, trying to process this revelation. "You're a war hero. I'm a soldier who survived when better men didn't." His voice was flat, emotionless. The medal, the land grants, the respect, they're all built on one terrible day. When I made choices that saved my unit but cost the lives of others. What kind of choices? The kind that haunt a man's sleep for the rest of his life. He turned away from her, staring out into the rain-soaked darkness. I led a charge that broke Confederate lines, but left 40 good men dead in a cornfield. The army called it heroic. I call it the worst day of my life. The pain in his voice was so raw that Etta felt tears spring to her eyes. Weston, I'm telling you this because if you marry me, you need to know what kind of man you're getting. Someone who makes hard choices when they need to be made, regardless of the personal cost. He faced her again, his expression vulnerable and determined. At once, someone who'll use every advantage he has to protect what matters to him. And I matter to you, more than I should let you, probably. His smile was sad and honest, enough that I'm willing to use my influence, my reputation, even my ghosts to keep you safe. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the porch roof with increasing intensity. In the distance, lightning flickered, illuminating the clouds that promised a thorough soaking for the drought-stricken land. Change was coming whether they were ready for it or not. If I say yes, Etta said carefully, what happens afterward, when this crisis is over and the threat has passed? Then we figure out what kind of marriage we want to have, day by day, choice by choice. Weston stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his pale eyes. I won't lie to you, Etta. I'm hoping for more than a business arrangement, but I'll settle for whatever you're willing to give, and if I can't give you what you hope for, then at least I'll know you and the baby are safe. Sometimes that has to be enough. The honesty in his answer made her chest tight with emotion. Here was a man offering her everything he had. His name, his protection, his resources, even his damaged heart, asking for nothing in return but the chance to care for her. Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, and Etta felt the baby respond to the sound with a series of strong kicks. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the life moving within her. Life that needed security, protection, a future free from the schemes of people like Mrs. Patterson and Jeremiah Blackwood. All right, she said quietly. All right? I'll marry you tomorrow morning if that's what it takes to stop them. She looked up at him, seeing relief and something deeper flash across his features. But Weston, I need you to know that I'm not Margaret. I can't replace what you lost. I'm not asking you to. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. I'm asking you to help me build something new. As they stood together on the porch, the rain washing away weeks of drought and dust, Etta felt something shift inside her chest. Fear remained, but it was joined now by anticipation, by the tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't facing an ending but a beginning. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Weston Cain, with all the protection and complications that name would bring. Tonight, she would sleep in Margaret's room, tend Margaret's roses, and prepare to step into a future she'd never imagined. The drought was ending, but the real test of their partnership was just beginning. Dawn broke grey and uncertain, the rain having settled into a steady drizzle that turned the world soft around the edges. Etta woke to the sound of Rosa moving quietly around the kitchen, the familiar rhythms of morning preparation that had become comforting during her stay at the ranch. But today felt different, charged with anticipation and dread in equal measure. Her wedding day. The thought still seemed surreal as she dressed in her best dress, a deep blue calico that had belonged to her mother. Rosa had pressed it carefully the night before and laid out an ivory lace mantilla that had been Margaret's, explaining that every bride needed something beautiful to mark the occasion, even if the circumstances were less than ideal. How are you feeling? Rosa asked when Etta emerged from her room, the older woman's eyes bright with concern and excitement, like I'm about to jump off a cliff without knowing how far the fall is. Etta replied honestly, accepting the cup of coffee Rosa offered. That's a marriage for you, Rosa said with a knowing smile. The ones that matter always feel that way. Through the kitchen window, Etta could see Weston and Miguel talking near the corral, their voices too low to carry over the sound of rain. Weston had dressed more formally than usual, in a dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and made him look every inch the successful rancher. Even from a distance, she could read the tension in his posture. He's nervous too, Rosa observed, following her gaze. How can you tell? 20 years of watching that man try to hide his feelings. He's doing that thing with his shoulders that he does when he's worried about something important. Rosa refilled Etta's coffee cup. It's good that he's nervous. Means it matters to him. The sound of approaching wagon wheels interrupted their conversation. Through the front window, Etta could see a small procession arriving, Doc Henley in his buggy, followed by Preacher Morrison in a wagon that carried what looked like several other passengers. Who else is coming? Etta asked, feeling a flutter of panic. Witnesses, Rosa explained. Maria and Carlos Gonzalez, the Hendersons from the North Section, people who know you both and can testify that this marriage is real and legitimate. The front door opened to admit Weston, who stamped the rain from his boots and removed his hat before entering the parlor. His eyes found Etta immediately, and she saw something soften in his expression as he took in her appearance. You look beautiful, he said quietly. Thank you. The simple compliment made her cheeks warm, and she found herself studying his face for signs of doubt or regret. Instead, she saw determination mixed with something that might have been tenderness. Doc Henley bustled in next, shaking rain from his coat and carrying his medical bag out of long habit. Morning all, quite a day for a wedding, but I suppose love doesn't wait for perfect weather. Behind him came Preacher Morrison, a kindly man in his 60s who'd presided over most of the territory's significant occasions for the past 2 decades. He greeted Etta with grandfatherly warmth, apparently unfazed by the rushed circumstances of the ceremony. Miss Morales, you're looking well. How are you feeling? Any concerns about the baby? I'm fine, Preacher. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Nonsense. When Weston Cain sends word that he needs a preacher, I come running. Besides, he added with a twinkle in his eye, it's been too long since we've had a wedding in these parts. The other guests filtered in gradually. Maria and Carlos Gonzalez, who ran a small spread to the east. John and Sarah Henderson, whose ranch bordered Weston's northern boundary. And Miguel, who stood quietly near the back with his hat in his, hands and pride evident on his weathered face. As they gathered in the parlor, Etta felt the reality of what was happening settle over her like Margaret's lace mantilla. These weren't strangers witnessing a business arrangement. They were neighbors and friends who'd known Weston for years, people who'd supported her through difficult times, a community coming together to celebrate what they clearly saw as a joyful occasion. Are we ready? Preacher Morrison asked, opening his worn Bible to pages marked with ribbon. Weston moved to stand beside Etta, close enough that she could smell the scent of bay rum and rain that clung to his jacket. Ready, he said, though his voice was rougher than usual. Dearly beloved, the preacher began, his voice carrying the authority of long practice, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Weston Cain and Etta Morales in holy matrimony. The familiar words washed over Etta like a tide, carrying her forward into something she'd never imagined for herself. She'd always assumed that if she married, it would be for love, surrounded by family, in the little church where her parents had been wed. Instead, she was standing in another woman's parlor, marrying a man she'd known for barely 2 months, for reasons that had more to do with survival than romance. But as Weston's voice joined hers in the traditional responses, something unexpected happened. The words that should have felt hollow and forced began to take on weight and meaning. When she promised to honor and cherish him, she found herself thinking of the patient care he'd shown during her illness, the gentle way he'd helped finish her father's cradle, the vulnerability he'd revealed the night before. Do you, Weston, take Etta to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do. His voice was steady, certain, and when she looked up at him, she saw no doubt in his pale eyes. And do you, Etta, take Weston to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? The moment stretched before her, like an open door. Through it lay safety for her child, security for their future, partnership with a man who'd already proven his worth. But it also meant stepping away from the fierce independence that had sustained her through every loss and hardship. I do, she said, and was surprised by the certainty in her own voice. Weston reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band that caught the lamplight with quiet elegance. As he slipped it onto her finger, Etta noticed that his hands were steady despite the magnitude of what they were undertaking. By the power vested in me by the territory of Oklahoma, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Preacher Morrison closed his Bible with a satisfied smile. Weston, you may kiss your bride. The moment hung between them, suddenly intimate despite the watching crowd. Weston's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing gently across her cheekbones. When his lips touched hers, the kiss was soft, respectful, but carrying an undercurrent of promise that made her pulse quicken. Mrs. Cain, he whispered against her lips, and the name sent an unexpected thrill through her. The small gathering erupted in congratulations and good wishes. Rosa produced champagne that she'd been saving for a special occasion, and Maria Gonzalez pressed a small wrapped package into Etta's hands with tears in her eyes. For the baby, she explained in accented English. Something I made. As the celebration continued around them, Etta found herself watching Weston accept congratulations from their neighbors. There was genuine warmth in their responses to the marriage, real happiness for a man they clearly respected and cared about. Whatever his past sorrows, he was valued by this community in ways that spoke well of his character. How do you feel? Doc Henley asked, appearing at her elbow with his professional manner intact despite the festive occasion. Different, she admitted. Like something fundamental has shifted, even though nothing has really changed. Everything has changed, he corrected gently. You're no longer alone, and neither is he. That's not a small thing, especially out here where survival often depends on having someone to depend on. Through the parlor window, Etta could see the rain continuing to fall, steady and nourishing, washing away the dust and drought that had threatened everything they'd tried to build. By evening, the earth would be soft and ready for new growth, prepared to support whatever seeds were planted in its renewed soil. As if responding to her thoughts, the baby gave a particularly strong kick, and Etta pressed her hand to her belly with a smile. Her child would grow up as a Cain now, with all the security and opportunity that name represented. Whatever uncertainties lay ahead in her marriage, she'd secured her child's future. Mrs. Cain, Weston appeared beside her, offering his arm. Shall we sign the papers? The marriage certificate lay spread on his desk, official and binding. As Etta signed her new name for the first time, she felt the final door close on her old life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning to live as part of a partnership, navigating the complexities of a marriage born from necessity rather than love, finding her place in a world so different from the one she'd known. But tonight, she was safe. Her child was protected, and the man beside her had proven that sometimes the most important promises were made not in passion, but in quiet determination to build something lasting together. The rain continued to fall, and Etta Cain allowed herself to hope that it was, washing away more than just the drought. The guests had departed by afternoon, leaving behind well wishes and the lingering warmth of community blessing. Etta sat in the parlor, still wearing her blue dress and Margaret's mantilla, staring at the gold band on her finger as if it belonged to someone else. The rain had intensified, creating a cocoon of sound that made the house feel separate from the rest of the world. Weston emerged from his study where he'd been reviewing legal documents with Doc Henley, his expression cautiously optimistic. "The marriage certificate has been properly filed and witnessed. Blackwood won't be able to challenge its legitimacy, so it's over. The threat to my land—" "The immediate threat, yes. Your status as my wife gives you legal protection they can't easily circumvent." He settled into the chair across from her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "But we should discuss what happens next." "Next? Your homestead. Whether you want to maintain it as a separate property or consolidate it with the ranch holdings." His voice was carefully neutral. "There are advantages to both approaches." Etta felt a pang at the thought of losing her father's land entirely, even to gain the security of Weston's vast holdings. "I'd like to keep it, if that's possible." "Of course. Miguel can continue overseeing the daily operations and you can visit whenever you'd like." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Though I hope you'll consider making the ranch your primary home, at least until after the baby comes. Because it's more practical. Because I'd like my child to be born here." The admission came quietly, but with unmistakable sincerity. "If you're comfortable with that, my child." The words sent a complex mix of emotions through Etta's chest. In accepting his proposal, she'd given him not just her hand but also parental rights to the baby she carried. It was a generous gesture on his part, claiming another man's child as his own, but it also meant sharing the most precious thing in her life. "You really mean that? About the baby?" "I mean it." Weston leaned forward, his expression earnest. "That child will bear the Cain name and inherit everything I have to give. In every way that matters, he or she will be mine." The certainty in his voice made Etta's eyes fill with unexpected tears. She'd spent months preparing to face single motherhood, to raise a child who would always carry the stigma of illegitimacy. Now, with a few words spoken before a preacher, that future had transformed completely. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank me by letting me be a good father." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his thumb tracing the edge of her new wedding ring. "I know I can't replace Thomas in your heart, and I'm not trying to, but I'd like to be something to this child, something real and lasting." The mention of Thomas brought a familiar ache, but it was softer now, tempered by time and the growing understanding that love could take many forms. What she'd shared with Thomas had been young and passionate and brief. What was developing with Weston felt different, deeper, more complex, built on shared struggle and mutual respect. "He wasn't my husband," she said suddenly. We lived together, and I called him my husband, but we never actually married." Weston's hand stilled on hers. "I wondered about that. The baby is his, but I was never Mrs. Whitfield. Mrs. Patterson knew that when she signed that forged certificate." Etta looked up at him, wanting him to understand the full truth. "You're the first man who's actually married me, and you're the second woman I've married," he replied quietly, "but the first I've chosen with a clear understanding of what marriage really means." "What does it mean?" "Partnership, loyalty, building something together that's stronger than what either person could create alone." His fingers interlaced with hers. "Margaret and I married young, carried away by passion and romantic ideals. We had to learn the harder truths later. And us? What are we building? I don't know yet, but I'm willing to find out if you are." The rain drummed against the windows with increasing intensity, and Etta realized that this conversation was more intimate than their wedding ceremony had been. They were finally speaking honestly about what their marriage might become, moving beyond the practical necessities that had brought them together. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of disappointing you, of not being able to love you the way Margaret did, of making a mistake that hurts us both." She gestured toward her belly. "Of raising a child in a marriage that's more obligation than affection." "Those are reasonable fears." Weston's voice was gentle. But consider this, we're starting with honesty instead of illusion, partnership instead of infatuation. Maybe that's a stronger foundation than what most couples build on. And if love never comes, then we'll have friendship, respect, and shared purpose. There are worse foundations for a marriage. He smiled, and she saw warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there when they first met. But I have hope for more. Why? Because when I kiss you, you kiss me back. Because you smile when I walk into a room. Because you've let me into your life in ways that go beyond mere convenience. His thumb traced across her knuckles. Because something is already growing between us, even if we're both too cautious to name it yet. The truth of his words made her chest tight with emotion. Over the past weeks, she had begun to anticipate his visits, to find comfort in his presence, to value his opinions and care about his welfare. What had started as gratitude and necessity had slowly transformed into something deeper. "Mrs. Cain," she said experimentally, testing how the name felt on her tongue. "Etta Cain," he replied and smiled at the sound. "It suits you." Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, and lightning briefly illuminated the rain-washed landscape beyond. The windows. The storm was intensifying, but from inside the solid walls of the ranch house, it felt more exhilarating than threatening. "Will you tell me about the medal?" Etta asked suddenly. "About what really happened at Gettysburg." Weston's expression grew serious, and for a moment she thought he might refuse. Then he reached into his vest and withdrew a small leather case she'd never seen before. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a bronze star hanging from a blue ribbon, the Congressional Medal of Honor. "July 2nd, 1863, he said quietly, his fingers tracing the edge of the medal without removing it from its case. "My unit was pinned down by Confederate artillery. If we'd stayed where we were, we'd all have been killed. If we retreated, we'd have left a gap in the line that could have cost the entire battle. So you advanced. I led a charge across open ground against fortified positions. 40 men followed me, and only 23 came back." His voice was steady, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "We broke their line and saved the day, but the cost was necessary," Etta finished gently. "You saved your unit and the battle. That's what leadership means." Margaret used to say the same thing, but the families of those 17 men might disagree. "And the families of the hundreds who would have died if you'd done nothing, they'd thank you." Etta reached over and closed the medal case with careful hands. "You carry their deaths, but you should also carry the lives you saved." They sat in companionable silence as the storm continued to rage outside. Etta found herself studying her husband's profile. When had she started thinking of him that way? Noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his hair curled slightly at his collar when it was damp from rain. "I should check on the animals," he said eventually, though he made no move to rise. "They're probably grateful for the rain. As am I." He looked at her with an expression that was becoming familiar, tender, protective, touched with wonder. "This morning I woke up alone. Tonight I'll have a wife. And tomorrow we start learning how to be married." He stood and offered her his hand. "Would you like to help me with the evening rounds? Rosa left soup warming, and we could eat together afterward." It was such a simple offer. Dinner with her husband after completing the day's chores together. The kind of ordinary domestic routine that married couples took for granted. But for Etta, who'd spent so many months alone, it felt like a precious gift. "I'd like that," she said, accepting his hand and allowing him to help her to her feet. As they prepared to brave the rain together, Etta reflected on the remarkable day that had transformed her from a struggling single woman into the wife of one of the territory's most respected men. The legal protections were important, the financial security crucial, but it was the small gestures, the way he'd claimed her child, the patience with which he answered her questions, the genuine care in his touch that made her believe there. Marriage might become something real. Outside, the rain continued to wash away the drought, preparing the earth for new growth. Inside, two people who'd married for practical reasons were discovering that sometimes the best love stories began not with passion, but with partnership, not with romance, but with respect. The storm would pass, but what they were building together might weather any weather. 6 weeks after the wedding, spring had transformed the Oklahoma Territory into something verdant and hopeful. The drought was nothing more than a memory, replaced by gentle rains that came at regular intervals and coaxed new life from soil that had seemed permanently damaged. Etta stood in Margaret's garden. Her garden now, she reminded herself, watching Weston work with the new plow he'd given her as a belated wedding gift. The implement was a work of art compared to her father's rusty blade, with steel shares that cut clean furrows and an adjustable mold board that turned the earth with mechanical precision. But more than its efficiency, she treasured what it represented. Acknowledgement that she would continue farming, that her skills and desires mattered in their partnership, that he understood her need to work the land with her own hands. "The wheat is coming along beautifully," Rosa observed, joining her on the garden path with a basket of fresh herbs. "Miguel says it might be the best crop this section has seen in years." The rain helped, but so did the new seed varieties Weston ordered. Etta adjusted her position carefully, her belly now prominent enough to require conscious attention to her balance. The baby was due within the month, and Doc Henley had pronounced both mother and child remarkably healthy during his most recent visit. "He's a good provider," Rosa said, with the satisfied air of a woman who'd seen her instincts proven correct. "Always has been, but he's got more purpose now, more reason to build for the future." Through the garden gate, Etta could see Miguel, directing a crew of workers who were constructing what would become a new barn. The old structure had been adequate, but Weston had declared it insufficient for their expanding operations. The new building would be twice the size, with modern ventilation and storage systems that reflected the latest agricultural innovations. Everything about the ranch spoke of growth and prosperity, but also of permanence, the kind of generational, thinking that came from understanding that what you built today would shelter your children and grandchildren. It was a perspective Etta had never been able to afford during her years of simple survival, but one she was learning to embrace. "Mrs. Cain?" A young voice called from the direction of the house. "Mrs. Cain, there's someone here to see you." Etta turned to see Jenny Patterson approaching, Mrs. Patterson's youngest daughter, who helped with cleaning at the ranch twice a week. The girl looked nervous, twisting her apron in her hands as she delivered her message. "Who is it, Jenny?" Mama, ma'am. She's waiting in the parlor with Mr. Cain. She asked me to fetch you if you're feeling up to visitors." The request was surprising enough to raise Etta's eyebrows. Mrs. Patterson had made her feelings about Etta's character abundantly clear over the months, and her role in the forged marriage certificate scheme had severed any possibility of polite relations between them. "Did she say what she wanted?" "No, ma'am, but she looks upset, like maybe she's been crying." Curious despite herself, Etta made her way to the house with Rosa accompanying her for moral support. In the parlor, she found Mrs. Patterson perched stiffly on the edge of a chair, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and her eyes red-rimmed. Weston stood near the window, his expression carefully neutral but his posture alert. "Mrs. Patterson," Etta said politely, "this is unexpected. Mrs. Cain." The older woman's voice cracked slightly on the title. "I've come to, that is, I need to—" She stopped, seemed to gather herself, then started again. "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Etta lowered herself carefully into a chair, studying the woman who'd caused her so much trouble. "What kind of apology?" "For the marriage certificate, for lying to Mr. Blackwood, for—" Mrs. Patterson's composure cracked entirely, and tears began flowing down her cheeks. "For being a spiteful, jealous woman who let her prejudices cloud her judgment." Weston moved closer to Etta's chair, his presence solid and reassuring. "What brought about this change of heart?" My husband found out what I'd done, what I'd signed my name to. Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. He was furious, said I'd disgraced our family name and put our business at risk by crossing the Cains. And, Etta prompted when the woman fell silent, he made me go to Mr. Blackwood and confess. Tell him the truth about the certificate, about how I'd lied in my testimony. Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped to a whisper. The bank has dropped all claims against your property. The foreclosure proceedings have been dismissed. Relief flooded through Etta, though the practical threat had been largely neutralized by her marriage. Still, knowing that her father's land was secure in its own right felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders. That's good news, Weston said carefully, but it doesn't explain why you did it in the first place. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting the handkerchief into knots. Because I was angry. Angry that she could work the land alone when I've never been allowed to do anything but keep house and mind the store. Angry that she carried herself with such pride when decent women whispered about her circumstances. Angry that men like you respected her when they'd never give a second thought to women like me. The honesty in the confession was startling. Etta had expected excuses or justifications, not this raw admission of jealousy and frustration. I convinced myself I was protecting the moral standards of the community, Mrs. Patterson continued. But the truth is, I was punishing you for having the courage to live on your own terms. And now I'm asking for your forgiveness. Not because I deserve it, but because I can't live with the guilt of what I tried to do to you and your child. Etta studied the older woman's face, reading genuine remorse in her expression. Forgiveness didn't come easily. The consequences of Mrs. Patterson's actions could have been devastating, but holding on to anger would only poison her own peace. I forgive you, she said quietly, but I won't forget. Mrs. Patterson nodded, seeming to understand the distinction. That's more than I have a right to ask for. She rose to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I think you and Mr. Cain are well suited. You both have the strength to build something lasting. After she left, Etta and Weston sat in the parlors, comfortable silence, processing the unexpected visit and its implications. How do you feel? He asked eventually. Relieved, vindicated. Etta considered the question more deeply. Sad for her, actually. It must be terrible to live with that much bitterness. Generous of you to feel sympathy for someone who tried to destroy your life. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just happy enough now that I can afford to be generous. The admission surprised them both. Etta realized she'd spoken a truth she hadn't fully acknowledged, that despite the practical origins of their marriage, she had found genuine happiness in their partnership. Are you happy? Weston asked, moving to sit beside her on the settee. More than I expected to be when I agreed to marry you. She smiled at his expression. Does that worry you? Only because I'm afraid you'll realize you could have done better. Better than a man who saved my land, claimed my child, and treats me like an equal partner. Etta shook her head. I think I'll keep you. He laughed, a sound of pure pleasure that made her heart quicken. Over the weeks of their marriage, she'd learned to love that laugh, to seek opportunities to coax it from him. He'd grown lighter somehow, more willing to show joy, as if her presence had given him permission to embrace happiness again. Speaking of keeping me, he said, reaching into his vest pocket, I have something for you. He withdrew a folded paper that she recognized as a property deed. Her name was written across the top in official script, Mrs. Etta Cain. Your homestead, he explained, legally transferred to your sole ownership, free and clear of any mortgage or lien. It's yours, completely independent of our marriage or my holdings. Tears sprang to Etta's eyes as she read the document. Weston, you didn't have to. Yes, I did. You need to know that your father's legacy is secure, that no one can ever threaten it again. His hand covered hers gently. And you need to know that if anything happens to me, or if you ever decide this marriage isn't what you want, you'll have somewhere to go. The gift was more than generous. It was a gesture of trust and respect that spoke volumes about how he viewed their partnership. By securing her independence, he'd proven that he wanted her to stay by choice, not obligation. "Thank you," she whispered, then leaned over to kiss him softly, for everything. The kiss lingered longer than she'd intended, and when they broke apart, she saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. The careful distance they'd maintained during the early weeks of their marriage had gradually eroded, replaced by a growing intimacy that felt natural and right. "Etta," he said quietly, "I need you to know that I love you." The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. She'd suspected his feelings had deepened, seen it in his gentle touches, his considerate gestures, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. But hearing him say it aloud changed everything. "I love you too," she replied, surprised by how easily the admission came. "I didn't expect to, but I do." "When did you know?" "When you gave me Margaret's gloves. When you finished my father's cradle. When you claimed my baby as your own." She smiled through her tears. "Maybe I've been falling in love with you gradually, one kindness at a time." They held each other as the afternoon light streamed through the parlor windows, illuminating a room that had once belonged to Margaret, but now felt like theirs. Outside, the sounds of ranch life continued. Horses nickering in the corral, workers calling to each other in Spanish and English, the distant sound of the new plow turning fresh earth for another season's planting. "What happens now?" Etta asked. "Now, we raise our child together. We build our ranch, tend our gardens, and see what grows." Weston's hand came to rest on her belly, feeling the baby's response to his touch. "We love each other, and let that be enough." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, the baby gave a particularly strong kick, making them both laugh. Soon their child would be born into a world of security and love, raised by parents who'd learned that the strongest foundations were built not on passion alone, but on partnership, respect, and the daily choice to care for each other's welfare. Bitum, drought that had brought them together, was nothing but memory now. In its place had grown something green and lasting, rooted deep in Oklahoma soil, and nourished by the understanding that some of life's greatest gifts came disguised as necessity. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising another gentle rain to water the crops they'd planted together. Inside, a man and woman who'd married as strangers held each other close, marveling at how love had found them when they least expected it but most needed it. The plow stood ready in the field. The roses bloomed in defiance of heat and hardship, and the future stretched before them like fertile ground waiting for seeds. They would plant those seeds together, tend them through seasons of plenty and want, and trust that what they built with love and patience would endure long after they were gone. In the end, that was what marriage really meant. Not the passionate promises of youth, but the steady commitment of two people determined to create something beautiful and lasting together, one day at a time.